She looked him straight in the eye and said no. Not rudely, not with malice, just a firm, quiet no that carried the weight of someone who had finally decided to stop being pushed around. The old man stood there for a moment, his weathered hands gripping a worn leather bag, his eyes tired but understanding. He didn't argue. He didn't demand. He just nodded once and began the slow shuffle toward the back of the plane. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few whispered behind cupped hands. One woman shook her head in obvious disapproval. A businessman in first class muttered something about respect for elders. But Sarah Chun didn't move. She'd paid for seat 14A fair and square, and she wasn't about to give it up because someone expected her to be the accommodating one again. What none of them knew, including Sarah, was that the quiet old man making his way to the cramped middle seat in row 27 had once prevented a disaster that would have changed the course of aviation history forever. And in less than 10 minutes, when the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, the entire cabin would learn exactly who they had just watched shuffle to the back of the plane. Welcome to the silent ranks. Before we dive deeper into what happened on Flight 847 that Tuesday morning, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories about everyday heroes deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of our community. It was supposed to be a routine morning flight from Denver to Phoenix. The kind of flight where business travelers catch up on emails, families juggle restless children, and most passengers settle in for 2 hours of relative peace at 30,000 feet. The Boeing 737 was nearly full, every seat occupied except for a handful in the back section that nobody wanted because of their proximity to the engines and bathrooms. Sarah Chun had arrived at the gate 40 minutes early, coffee in hand, laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She was heading to Phoenix for a job interview that could change everything. After 18 months of unemployment, after watching her savings dwindle and her confidence erode, this marketing director position represented more than just a paycheck. It was validation. It was hope. It was her chance to prove she still mattered in a world that seemed to have forgotten she existed. She'd specifically chosen seat 14A when she booked online 3 weeks earlier. Window seat, emergency exit row, extra legroom. Worth the additional $35 she could barely afford because she needed every advantage she could get. She planned to review her presentation materials during the flight, to arrive in Phoenix feeling prepared and confident instead of cramped and frazzled. The boarding process went smoothly until she noticed the commotion near the front of the plane. A flight attendant was speaking quietly with an elderly man who appeared to be traveling alone. He was thin, probably in his 70s, wearing a simple gray cardigan over a white button-down shirt. His pants were pressed but showed their age, and his black shoes were polished to a shine that spoke of old habits and careful maintenance. The flight attendant glanced down the aisle, her eyes scanning seat numbers and passenger faces. Sarah had seen this before. Someone with status or connections was about to get an upgrade, or someone was going to be asked to move to accommodate a family or help resolve an overbooking situation. She turned her attention back to her phone, determined to avoid eye contact that might make her a candidate for involuntary seat relocation. But the footsteps stopped right beside her row. "Excuse me, miss?" The flight attendant's voice was professionally polite, but carried an undertone of urgency. "I'm wondering if you might be willing to help us out with a small situation." Sarah looked up to find the elderly man standing in the aisle, his pale blue eyes apologetic but patient. Up close, she could see the careful way he held himself, the slight tremor in his left hand, and something else that was harder to define. A quietness that seemed to run deeper than mere introversion. "This gentleman needs to sit near the front of the aircraft for medical reasons," the flight attendant continued. "Would you be willing to switch seats with him? We'd be happy to offer you a travel voucher for your flexibility." The request hit Sarah like a familiar punch to the stomach. Always the one expected to accommodate. Always the one assumed to be flexible, understanding, willing to make sacrifices for the greater good. How many times had she given up what she'd paid for, what she'd planned for, what she'd needed, because someone else's situation was deemed more important? She glanced at the old man again. He wasn't demanding anything. He wasn't entitled or pushy. In fact, he looked almost embarrassed by the attention. But that didn't change the fact that Sarah had paid for this seat specifically, had budgeted for it carefully, and needed every possible advantage for what might be the most important day of her professional life. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, meeting the flight attendant's eyes, "but I can't switch seats today." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. The flight attendant's eyebrows rose slightly. A passenger in the row behind them made a small sound of disapproval. Someone else whispered something that sounded like unbelievable. The elderly man stepped forward slightly, his voice soft and gravelly. "It's perfectly fine, miss. I understand completely." He turned to the flight attendant. "I'll take whatever seat you have available." But the damage was already done. As the old man made his way toward the back of the plane, Sarah felt the weight of judgment settling over her like a heavy blanket. Passengers watched him go, then looked back at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disgust. A woman across the aisle shook her head and muttered something to her husband about the selfishness of young people. A businessman in first class turned around to get a better look at the person who had refused to help an elderly passenger. Sarah stared out the window, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and defiance in equal measure. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd paid for her seat, she had important reasons for needing it, and she wasn't obligated to sacrifice her comfort for a stranger, regardless of his age. But the disapproving looks and whispered comments made it clear that her fellow passengers saw things differently. The flight attendant completed her safety demonstration with professional efficiency, but Sarah noticed the slightly cooler tone when she asked if anyone in the emergency exit row was willing and able to assist in case of evacuation. A few passengers continued to glance back at her throughout the safety briefing, and Sarah found herself second-guessing her decision even as she tried to focus on her presentation notes. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Sarah caught a glimpse of the elderly man in her peripheral vision. He was seated in 27E, the dreaded middle seat between a large man who had claimed both armrests and a woman with a crying baby. He sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead with the kind of patience that comes from having endured far worse than airline inconvenience. Something about his composure bothered her more than anger or complaint would have. He seemed genuinely unbothered by the cramped quarters, the crying child, and the armrest situation. He hadn't tried to guilt her into changing her mind or make a scene about the medical necessity the flight attendant had mentioned. He'd simply accepted the situation and moved on. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the Colorado morning sky. Sarah tried to return her attention to her laptop, but found herself distracted by the continued whispers and glances from nearby passengers. A flight attendant walking down the aisle paused to check on the elderly man, speaking to him quietly and respectfully. Whatever medical concern had prompted the initial seat request didn't seem to be causing any immediate problems. 20 minutes into the flight, as the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turned off, Sarah finally managed to lose herself in reviewing her presentation materials. The job interview was for a senior marketing position with a growing tech company, and she'd spent weeks preparing for every possible question and scenario. This was her chance to get back into the career she loved, to prove that her extended unemployment had been a temporary setback rather than a permanent defeat. She was deep in thought about market positioning strategies when the pilot's voice came over the intercom. Pilot announcements were usually routine updates about weather, flight time, or altitude. Passengers typically ignored them or used the interruption to check their phones or visit the restroom. But something in Captain Morrison's tone made everyone in the cabin pay attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I rarely make personal announcements during flight, but today I need to share something important with all of you." The casual conversations throughout the cabin died away. Passengers looked up from their books and devices. Even the crying baby seemed to quiet down. "We have someone very special traveling with us today, and I don't think he would ever tell you himself. So I'm going to tell you who he is." Sarah felt a strange tightness in her chest. She glanced toward the back of the plane, though she couldn't see the elderly man from her position. Captain Morrison's voice continued, clear and steady over the intercom. "The gentleman sitting in seat 27E is Colonel James Mitchell, United States Air Force, retired. 43 years ago, Colonel Mitchell was the co-pilot on a commercial flight that experienced catastrophic engine failure over the Rocky Mountains. The cabin was now completely silent except for the steady hum of the engines. When the captain was incapacitated and the plane was going down with 127 souls on board. Then Lieutenant Mitchell took control of the aircraft. With no engine power and limited hydraulics, he managed to glide that plane to an emergency landing in a field outside Colorado Springs. Not a single person died that day because of his skill, his courage, and his refusal to give up when everyone else thought the situation was hopeless. Sarah's laptop screen blurred as tears filled her eyes. Around her, passengers were turning to look toward the back of the plane. Some were already reaching for their phones to record what they somehow knew was about to become an extraordinary moment. Colonel Mitchell never sought recognition for what he did that day. The captain continued. He returned to military service, flew combat missions, trained other pilots, and served his country for 3 more decades. He retired quietly, and most people have no idea that they're in the presence of someone who saved 127 lives before breakfast on a Tuesday morning in 1981. The captain paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of respect and admiration that made everyone in the cabin lean forward to listen. Colonel Mitchell is traveling to Phoenix today for medical treatment at the VA hospital. When I learned he was on my flight, I wanted to make sure he had every comfort we could provide. But apparently, he's perfectly happy in whatever seat he's given, because that's the kind of man he is. Sarah's hands were shaking now. She could hear passengers around her beginning to whisper, but the whispers had changed from judgment to awe. Someone in the row behind her said, "Oh my God." Another passenger was quietly crying. Captain Morrison wasn't finished. "I've been flying for 26 years, and I can honestly say that every pilot in commercial aviation owes something to Colonel Mitchell. What he did in 1981 changed how we train for emergency situations. His actions that day have saved countless lives in the decades since, because we learned from his example how to land a plane when everything goes wrong." The intercom crackled slightly, and then the captain's voice returned, softer but still clear throughout the cabin. "Colonel Mitchell, if you can hear me back there, sir, I want you to know that it's an honor to be your pilot today. And I want everyone on this flight to know that they're sharing airspace with a genuine American hero." The silence that followed was profound and heavy. Sarah sat frozen in her window seat. Staring at the laptop screen, she could no longer see through her tears. Around her, passengers were turning in their seats, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man in 27E. The businessman in first class who had muttered about respect was now standing in the aisle, looking toward the back of the plane with an expression of profound shame. And then, from somewhere near the front of the cabin, came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. It started with 1 person, then 2, then 5. Within seconds, every passenger on the plane was applauding, and many were standing. The applause wasn't polite or perfunctory. It was deep and sustained, and carried the weight of genuine gratitude and respect. Sarah could see him now, just barely, through the space between seats and standing passengers. Colonel James Mitchell was still sitting quietly in his middle seat, his weathered hands resting in his lap. He wasn't acknowledging the applause or standing to wave. He simply sat there with the same patient dignity he'd shown throughout the boarding process, as if being honored by a plane full of strangers was just another thing to be endured with grace. The applause continued for what felt like several minutes. Passengers were wiping away tears, hugging each other, and some were taking pictures or videos. A flight attendant made her way to the back of the plane and knelt beside Colonel Mitchell's seat, speaking to him quietly and respectfully. Sarah watched all of this through a haze of tears and shame so profound she could barely breathe. This was the man she had refused to help. This was the medical situation she had dismissed. This was the person she had forced to squeeze into a middle seat between strangers while she protected her extra legroom and her presentation materials. The applause finally died down, and passengers began to settle back into their seats. But the energy in the cabin had completely changed. People were talking quietly to each other, sharing their amazement and their respect for the hero in their midst. Some were looking up Colonel Mitchell's story on their phones, finding old newspaper articles and aviation records that confirmed everything the captain had said. Sarah sat in her window seat, untouched coffee growing cold on her tray table, presentation materials forgotten in her lap. She stared out at the landscape passing far below and tried to process what had just happened. In her mind, she replayed the boarding process, her refusal to switch seats, the elderly man's gracious acceptance of her decision. She remembered his quiet dignity, his lack of entitlement, his gentle assurance that he understood completely. He had saved 127 lives. He had changed aviation safety forever. He was traveling to Phoenix for medical treatment at a veterans hospital, which meant he had probably sacrificed his health in service to his country. And when asked to move to an uncomfortable seat, he had done so without complaint or explanation, because that was the kind of person he was. Sarah had been so focused on protecting what she saw as hers, so determined not to be taken advantage of, that she had completely missed the opportunity to show kindness to someone who had dedicated his life to protecting others. She had been protecting her comfort while sitting next to a man who had once risked everything to save strangers. The shame was overwhelming, but it was quickly joined by something else, a determination to make this right. Sarah closed her laptop and stood up. The flight attendant who had originally asked her to switch seats was walking down the aisle, and Sarah caught her attention. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, "about the seat situation earlier. I've changed my mind. If Colonel Mitchell would be more comfortable up here, I'd like to offer him my seat." The flight attendant looked surprised, then smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you. Let me go check with him." Sarah watched as the flight attendant made her way to the back of the plane and knelt beside the colonel's seat again. She could see them talking, see the colonel shake his head slightly, see the flight attendant gesture toward the front of the plane where Sarah was standing. After a brief conversation, the flight attendant returned. "He says he's perfectly comfortable where he is," she reported. "But he asked me to thank you for the offer and to tell you that he appreciates your kindness." Sarah felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Even now, even after being publicly honored and recognized, Colonel Mitchell was more concerned with not inconveniencing her than with his own comfort. She wanted to walk back there herself, to apologize personally, to explain that she hadn't known, to somehow make up for her earlier selfishness. But she realized that might make the situation more about her feelings than about his dignity. Instead, she sat back down and spent the rest of the flight thinking about what she had learned, not just about Colonel Mitchell, but about herself. The remainder of the flight passed quietly. Passengers continued to glance back toward row 27 with expressions of respect and wonder. A few approached Colonel Mitchell to shake his hand or thank him personally, and he received each interaction with the same gracious humility he had shown throughout the journey. As the plane began its descent into Phoenix, Captain Morrison made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, I want to thank you all for making this such a special flight. It's been an honor to serve as your pilot today, and an even greater honor to share the cockpit airspace with Colonel Mitchell." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. "I hope everyone on this flight will remember what we've learned today. Heroes don't always look like what we expect. They don't always announce themselves or demand recognition. Sometimes they're sitting quietly in the middle seat, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, but deserving everything." The landing was smooth and uneventful. As passengers began to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark, something beautiful happened. Without any coordination or prompting, people began stepping aside to let Colonel Mitchell move to the front of the plane. It wasn't dramatic or showy. Passengers simply waited, allowing the elderly man to make his way forward with dignity and without rushing. Sarah stood with the rest of them, her carry-on bag in hand, watching as Colonel Mitchell walked slowly down the aisle. When he reached her row, he paused and met her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he smiled, a gentle expression that held no judgment, no resentment, only understanding. "Thank you for the offer, miss," he said quietly. "You have a kind heart." And then he continued forward, leaving Sarah standing in the aisle with tears streaming down her face and a completely changed perspective on what it means to be truly strong. At the gate, Sarah watched through the window as Colonel Mitchell was met by what appeared to be family members and perhaps some Veterans Organization representatives. They embraced him warmly, and she could see them talking animatedly, probably asking about the flight and the unusual recognition he had received. Sarah's job interview went well. Better than well, actually. But throughout the process, she found herself thinking less about market positioning strategies and more about the quiet dignity of a man who had saved 127 lives and then spent the next 4 decades serving others without seeking recognition. She got the job, but more importantly, she got a lesson that changed how she saw the world and her place in it. Sometimes we're so focused on protecting what we think we deserve that we miss the chance to give what someone else needs. Sometimes the person sitting next to us, the stranger in line, the elderly man shuffling to the back of the plane, has a story that would humble us if we only took the time to listen. Colonel James Mitchell never needed Sarah's seat. He had survived far worse than airline inconvenience. But the offer to give it up, the gesture of putting someone else's comfort before her own, would have been a gift not just to him, but to herself. A chance to be part of something larger than her own immediate needs. The real tragedy wasn't that she initially said no. The real tragedy was how close she came to missing the lesson entirely. How close she came to walking away from that flight unchanged, focused only on her interview and her presentation materials, never knowing she had shared space with genuine greatness. But sometimes life gives us second chances. Sometimes we get the opportunity to learn, to grow, to become better than we were. Sometimes a pilot's voice over an intercom can change everything we thought we knew about strength, sacrifice, and what it really means to serve others. Sarah never forgot Flight 847. She never forgot the lesson of the middle seat and the man who took it without complaint. And in the years that followed, whenever she had the chance to choose between protecting what was hers and giving what someone else needed, she remembered Colonel Mitchell's quiet dignity and made a different choice. Because heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear gray cardigans and polished shoes and carry worn leather bags. Sometimes they sit in middle seats and accept whatever comfort they're given without asking for more. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to recognize them before it's too late. Sometimes we get the chance to be heroes ourselves, not by saving lives or flying planes, but by simply offering our seat to someone who has already given more than we can imagine. This story was brought to you by Silent Ranks. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe it was a teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, a neighbor who quietly helped families in need, or a family member who sacrificed their dreams so others could achieve theirs. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their quiet heroism changed your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.